Hi, everybody. We're going to get started. I know Julie really well, but I have a script to keep me on the rails. Here we go. I'm Carl Lestrito. I'm the director of the School of Architecture. This is my Sarah Lowe impression, by the way, for people who were here last week. I'm going to introduce you to Julie Kress, the Tennessee Architecture Fellow, but first I want to say a few words about the fellowship program. It supports early career academics by providing resources for a research project to be undertaken during 2 years of full-time teaching at the College of Architecture and Design. Fellows are selected via a national search with applicant proposals and teaching potential evaluated by a faculty committee with input by students. We ask the fellows to offer a public lecture and exhibit at the conclusion of the 2 years in this role, in part because we recognize that their work has grown in unique ways as a result of being here in Tennessee, here at the college, and here in this building with these people. Julie's exhibition is now open in the 103 gallery, visible from the atrium. If you haven't seen it yet, I dare you to walk by and not fall into its whimsical gravity well. I'm going to come back to whimsical as my introductory theme here. The fellowship program started in the School of Architecture, and I note with some pride that there are a couple of fellows here in the audience. When Jason Young became the dean of the college, he expanded the program to the 3 other schools. As it grew, the fellowship program has created a kind of subculture. Thank you, Julie, for serving on the search committee for the next Tennessee Architecture Fellow who will join us in the fall. I know many of us have lots of other reasons to thank Julie, too. Her record here is characterized by her capacity to help others disseminate their work. For example, she's curated and organized many exhibits on behalf of the college. During her fellowship, she advanced the experimental trajectory of our representation sequence in the M.Arch program, taught collaboratively in the second-year studio, and developed a research-oriented professional electives. She's a sought-after member of Master of Architecture project committees, having served on, by my count, at least 4 in the last 2 years. She's currently teaching a creative research diploma studio, also known as an option studio. And I emailed the students in that studio in secret. Sorry, Julie. I found that students love to be emailed in secret by the director. It's one of the ways I exert my soft power. I asked them to each provide me 1 word that describes the experience. They replied very fast. There's clearly a culture of accountability in that studio. And I have also found that people reply fast to emails if you ask them to reply back with 1 word. So here are the words that I got. I've categorized them. There's a cognitive creative disposition category, and the words are resourceful, imaginative, and adventurous. It's good. These describe modes of thinking, an active, agile, generative intelligence. They imply risk-taking and invention under constraint. There's a philosophical qualities category, esoteric, exploratory, and enriching. This group suggests a practice that values depth, complexity, and a kind of slow or layered knowing, something invested in process and discovery rather than clarity alone. And then there's the best category, formal material conditions, and those words that were provided by students were fluid, dynamic, eclectic, and whimsy. These are all about how things behave in space, kinetics, aesthetic pluralisms, and a sense of play. They're less about structure and more about atmosphere, attitude, and motion. So for a while, I was going to do the thing where I asked ChatGPT to make poetry with those. And you know the pattern of ChatGPT prompting where you just do more of that thing? I was like, more Julie Kress. Julie Kress is famous enough to have an internet presence and have been scraped by ChatGPT. So it knows about Julie Kress. So I was like, more Julie Kress, more Julie Kress, more Julie Kress. It wasn't, I'm not going to quote that here. You can do that on your own time. But I ended up lingering on that last word supplied by a student, whimsy. It struck with me because it kind of implies a lightheartedness, and there is a lightheartedness about Julie. Students know she's not going to yell at you, you know. the meanest thing she'll say is like, the but now is where I will tell you that I first met Julie on the phone when I was recruiting her to come to RISD in the program that I was directing. She had recently graduated from Temple University with a degree in architecture, and that's the story, that phone call, that I'm going to spare you from hearing about. I also want to note that she ended up going to RISD. I taught her in a research studio, a lot like the one she's teaching now, and she did a good job. Around the same time, she did an independent study on foam and how it can exist digitally, while also collaboratively teaching a course she proposed to the grad school. She went on to win the department's thesis prize and then practiced as an exhibit designer in Boston before joining the UTK faculty as a lecturer in 2021. She's been productive publishing her work, including at 3 conferences and in 2 books in recent years. And so with those facts established, I can now return to the theme of whimsy. So children's books are whimsical, cartoons are whimsical, and I am told that we will have a 2-lecture streak of cartoon references. The first being Matt Flores's reference of Wile E. Coyote. But I think what we'll see in her lecture is that her whimsy, like her play, is serious, disciplined, and the result of meticulous attention to digital and material craft. Her work is obviously beautiful and at times hilarious, but also very critical. It reminds me of the theme for this year's lecture series. It was developed by Catty Dan Zhang, Faye Nixon, Julie Kress herself, because she's on the committee, and me, also on the committee. We want our lectures this year to have inadvertent lines of communication with each other. We also think themes ask something of our lectures. And this year the theme was truth. And while the charge to Julie, like Matt, was really to just tell us about their work, it does so happen that I see a bit of truth in her work. Julie's truth arises from the candid exposure of representation. She's going to help us enjoy what we're seeing, see differently, and then see how we're seeing. I said earlier that a lot of us need to thank Julie, so let's do that now as we welcome her to the podium.
Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to be here today. And thank you, Carl, for the very sweet and generous introduction. He was actually one of my graduate thesis advisors 5 years ago. So Carl has really seen my work evolve since the beginning. So it's incredibly meaningful for me that he's introducing me today for the next checkpoint of my research. The fellowship work I'll be sharing with you today expands on my endless fascination with how we can freely engage digital tools as a conceptual sandbox. This animation is generated using a particle physics simulation, and when I say generated, that does not mean it was effortless or fast, and it was not aided by AI. I manually composed a scene, a cube filled with particles, designed the motion path of a drawing tool to inscribe the particles' width, and played the simulation to see what would happen. It took many rounds of recalibrating the scene and recalculating the simulation before I was satisfied with the results. Working with interactive simulations was the first time where I felt like I was really co-authoring with a digital medium. It was a messy negotiation with digital matter akin to working with splattered ink. This one is titled Plopped Grids. 10-second animations are ideal for my world of material explorations. I find that it's just long enough to breathe life into an image and make sense of a material effect, but it's not so long that it needs additional narrative, plot, or intent in order to hold our attention. I will say if played at 24 frames per second, these animations each require roughly 240 images to convey the quality of a drape, jiggle, or collapse. So the short clip is also more conducive to my computer's storage limit. My process is ever evolving, but I wanted to share some of these early experiments with you because you'll notice later in my presentation how some of these material behaviors and jokes seem to reoccur as themes and ingredients in my later work. I think I need to find some alternative words, but I often use digital to refer to things like digital scaffolds, hair, pillows, and quilts. The word digital reminds me that these things are something immaterial, encoded with bits and pixels, while the metaphors give me something tangible to make sense of what I'm seeing on the screen. These metaphors are also operative. They give me a way to conceptually hack tools and resist their intended use. For instance, each of these animations use a hair simulation that would commonly be used in animated films. What's missing is the body and the hair follicles. I plucked the digital hair and rearranged them in a dense lattice. The new hair model, detached from a head, appears in this case to have taken on its own. Architects are well trained with the visual production of drawings, images, models, scripts, and simulations. But this labor is amplified in the case of animation. The logistics of animation is computational in nature, involving sorting through lists of images, establishing registration points, adhering to an optical grid, and incrementally shifting elements according to a planned frame rate. It requires hundreds of precisely calibrated images and special workflows to manage this format. After working some digital magic, such as creating hair that doesn't reference a body or gravity, I've felt curious about how to bring these strange materials back to Earth. I pivoted from the language of pixels to the language of ink. I translated physics simulations produced in Autodesk Maya into sets of line work that could be executed by an AxiDraw pen plotter. I was delighted when the effect of the physics simulation was merged with animated pen strokes. It gave a springiness to an inky line that was unfamiliar and strange. Collapsing scaffold, 5 lines in a stack, and jumping scaffold each use hair physics simulations to produce an equally odd effect in which inked lines bend and bounce together. It's a physical drawing with digital precision, portraying a realistic bounce of a hair simulation mixed with imperfections of the plotter, pen, and the paper surface. The process of extracting frames and pen plotting them was mesmerizing. Laying out the animations into matrices produced fascinating drawings in their own right. I enjoyed the glitches and misalignments that occurred when the plot went wrong, and the variety of strokes you could achieve by varying the pen and speed. However, it was no easy task to realign the images after they had been pulled apart. In order to recalibrate these images for animation, I imported the scans of the plot into Photoshop, and layer by layer I would crop and realign the image. The process was finicky, slow, and boring. Some of the animations I hoped to create could have over 200 frames, and I couldn't fathom continuing in this direction unless I found a way to automate the process. For your reference, I'm most experienced in 3D animation, and in that scenario, this little part of aligning frames is usually fully automated. In this simulated environment, you produce a 3D model of a scene, then you place a virtual camera within the scene. You can quickly preview the result, recalibrate your camera positioning, and once you are satisfied, you may render out everything at a click of a button, and your folder is populated with hundreds of images, seamlessly aligned to produce a perfected animated sequence. The process is efficient, effortless, invisible, really. I turned to the process of stop-motion photography, aided by the software Dragon Frame. With a camera live linked, I could preview the animation as I went. As I first embarked on this process, there was a moment in which I thought to myself, if only I had a device that rotated so it was easier to feed the strip to the camera. My next thought was, oh crap, I just reinvented the film strip. It was certainly possible to explore ways of automating this process, but I discovered that the meticulous process of stop motion became a new way of interfacing with the digitally produced images that I would have taken for granted if I had left them as digital animations and never created this problem for myself of animating a physical image. Working with stop motion gave me a similar delight to physics simulation. It was interactive, and I was suddenly able to make the film strip dance in ways that would not have been imaginable otherwise. I was supposed to speak slower during this one. I now had the ability to author the frame-to-frame relationship that is often taken for granted in the digital animation process, and I discovered that replacing a batch process with my embodied presence as a photographer evoked kind of a meta performance of the labor involved in generating digital imagery. Philip Denny poses a question: why should an inquisitive observer of the world not be content with images, but rather insist on material objects? He answers that giving material form to an ephemeral event suspends a fleeting process in time, inviting new perceptions of a dynamic world. When considering giving material form to animation, it's also worth considering the ways in which animation has historically already been material. For instance, the phenakistoscope is one of the earliest forms of animation. Really, it was a toy that created an optical illusion when it was spun. There were also zoetropes that rotated the image plane up to be vertical and would sometimes feature three-dimensional figures. Here you see a zoetrope built by Etienne Jules Mouret that captures a cycle of seagulls' flight in 10 frames. I used these spinning mechanisms as a starting point to consider how the method I used to array the animations was in relation to the way I would manipulate the path of the paper later on. At one point, I did consider simulating my intended paper paths ahead of time so that I could think through how the contents of the animation would respond to the way the film is manipulated or spun. On the right, it seems interesting enough. You can see how the paper would move, but in order to see the resulting animation, the frames need to be aligned. On the left, they are aligned, but the results were unimpressive because the alignment of the film strips was too perfect, and it didn't appear to spin at all. And I was encouraged that the imperfections of the paper and maybe my hand popping into the camera occasionally were far more compelling than what I could ever simulate. Beyond early examples specific to animation, I also love the rich history of inventions surrounding projective geometry and image production. This is an early example of anamorphic projection, in which a fresco of a landscape is skewed along a long hallway so that from your vantage point walking down the hallway, it will have the illusion that you are walking directly into the landscape. So if you turned head on to the wall, it would be very stretched out, but when you're oriented, the vanishing point kind of aligns. I had to play a similar game when distributing my animations because when they were arrayed, they were no longer referencing the same vanishing points or the same horizon lines from a single camera view. So I had to manipulate the geometry so that it faked a perspectival image from a top-down perspective. So now when you see it arrayed, it's like a top-down orthographic view, but the object is morphed perspectively. When working on this jumping lattice, I initially was looking at early exercises for character animation. The flour sack problem is the animator's equivalent to the architect's 9-square grid problem. Young animators are prompted to give life to a flour sack through simple poses that elicit emotions. So a sack can have curiosity, or be cocky, laugh, or even throw a tantrum. It's interesting that even in the 1600s, there was a desire to be inside of our images, or for the images to be seamless with the realities they depict. As I brought human qualities to the jumping lattice, there was an impulse I had to start to interact with it, or even be the source of its movement. Tim Arment helped me with some motion capture in the Digital Futures Lab, and there's various ways I've considered either becoming the character or maybe being inside of the character. This early example of a camera obscura hosted within a tent room set in the landscape maybe points to other ways of being inside of the mechanism of image production. I was fascinated by how technology can maybe envelop us. The multiplane camera, developed by Disney animator Iwerks in 1933, carries a resemblance to the tent obscura in which the camera becomes environment simply to the sheer scale of the object. The vertical column of planes allowed the animators to position multiple layers of acetate cells on top of one another, and this advanced two-dimensional animation techniques to now have a third dimension in depth relative to the camera. So it led to depth of field effects, parallax, and zooming. I have a note here that says, pause, take a sip of water. So a funny side note, when I made this animation, it's at a climber's crag, kind of in an isolated location in Obed Wild Scenic Area. And I thought I was going to have a really peaceful day alone, just out in the woods. And it turned out to be Climb with a Ranger Day. So out of the camera view, there's 30 people at least with kids, like families, layers and layers of families. One kid did come by and he asked me, "What are you taking a photo of? Is there an animal in there?" and I replied like, "No, I just like landscapes." And he said, "Oh," disappointed. In the fall of 2023, I had the opportunity to co-curate a show with Mark Stanley titled AI to be Determined. It featured works by Shelby Doyle, Curry Hackett, and Andrew Cudless exploring the potentials of AI. This title wall was designed by Chris Cope, by the way. The reason I mention this show is that you may have noticed the animation we just watched featured some of the aluminum angles that you see here. They served as guides for my film strips and were bent and angled to conform to the specificities of the landscape. I recycled these from this past show as they were just sitting in my office and offered a simple solution for organizing mass-produced imagery. It makes me laugh to think about how the same element could hold computationally produced images from total opposite ends of the labor-time spectrum. Here you see the aluminum not purely acting as a passive guide or armature for the paper, but it's now an interactive piece that frames the animation. The frame shrinks while the pen plot bounces around a virtual box, constricting their movement over time. The frame has been an active agent in my design work from the beginning, and I love looking at how the frame becomes an operative agent in the scene that is framed. On the right, you see Daffy Duck fighting the masking of the film strip. On the left, you see Homer kind of seamlessly slip through a wall out of the two-dimensional world of the animation into a digital 3D world. There's a moment where his family realizes he's missing, and you hear them call, "Homer, where are you?" And he replies, "I'm somewhere where I don't know where I am." Like in The Simpsons, the holodeck in Star Trek features gridded floors and walls to represent virtual space, and the door frame signifies the threshold between the virtual and material realities. This, in my mind, is similar to how a cabinet of curiosities helps to mark or frame a threshold between two material realities. This animation is the grandparent of the pen plot we just saw. It features the same particle system, but rather than be contained by aluminum angles, it's contained by a terrarium. As grids are typically infinite, here I considered containing gridded smoke, which resists containment. I would like to expand my definition of frames to also include dioramas. Richard Barnes' photographs begin to break the boundary between worlds by capturing the moment in which the caretakers enter into the diorama with ladders, brooms, and vacuums in tow. This digital diorama, which also uses the same particle system, plays off of the history of the Cabinet of Curiosities and museum diorama, where a lifelike digital symbiotic scaffold is trapped, though the hinged door is ajar. When I moved to Tennessee, I was in awe of the landscapes and wilderness areas I encountered. Over the past 2 years, I have been digitally collecting scans of landscapes, or maybe specimens, just with my phone. It's important to find a hiking partner who matches your rhythm and pace. I would go on long, meandering hikes with my friend Kalia Johnson, who's a photographer, and we would walk only a short ways before our attention was diverted to a plant or rock face that she would leap to photograph and I would excitedly scan. I also mention her because I believe a mix of these photographs were taken by her. We exchanged many photos that have found their way into my archive, and I lost track whose is whose. As you may have noticed from the collections I've shown you so far, I'm fascinated by histories of curation and collecting dating back to taxidermy and the curation of cabinets of curiosities. I see the scanning practice as a digital extension of those practices, and taxidermy typically pertains to the preservation of animal remains involving the arrangement of skin to resemble the original living animal it came from. Darkly, it feels animation adjacent to me as an art of bringing things to life. I've been referring to my scanning as a process of landscape taxidermy to consider the process of digitally capturing and harvesting landscapes rather than animals through 3D scanning. My specimens vary in scale and detail and come from a range of iconic and unfamiliar natural landscapes in Obed National Wild and Scenic River and the Great Smoky Mountains. Also, 3 years ago, I started to rock climb outdoors. Searching for climbing areas gave me a motivation to access new landscapes off of the beaten paths. I didn't ask the friends who are here right now if I could feature them in these videos. They just learned just now. But it also gave me new access to vertical surfaces that I only ever had seen from ground level. There's knowledge that you form after the effort and labor of traversing a landscape or climbing it that can't really be processed just by looking at it. I will also say that climbing requires community, and I am grateful to my friends and belay partners who patiently, slowly lowered me to the ground while I held my phone and scanned every piece of moss, stone, and crevice that caught my attention. You get the idea. Translating scans to pen plots was a tricky endeavor. The landscapes were most legible with a 5-inch by 5-inch plot, which would require far too much paper and time to pen plot a 100-frame animation, if you can do the math. I arrived at a process of creating a lower resolution landscape by draping it. I arranged the movement of the fabric in a site-specific manner, but it was not so important at this time to retain all of the sticks, leaves, and stones that initially drew me to the site. I do have a history and maybe obsession for draping things. Coaxing fabric to interact with nuanced surfaces has to be carefully choreographed, and it creates a performance within a scene that would be static otherwise. So here you see a tiled bathtub draped with a gridded cloth. And I'm not the only one to drape a landscape. This was used as a passive defense tactic in World War II to disguise an aircraft plant as suburbia, to conceal the operations from the vantage point of enemy aircrafts above. I also adore this study by Reiser and Uemoto that explores how the appearance of draped fabric looks familiar and natural at the scale of clothing, and seems familiar still at the scale of a room, but very strange when it's larger than a house but smaller than a building. But then it starts to feel familiar and natural again at the scale of the landscape, or at the scale of maybe an ocean. So to access these sites for the final animations in context, I had to traverse some trails carrying the aluminum angles I designed specifically for those landscapes, along with a portable generator, 2 cameras and tripods, many backup camera batteries, some additional lighting, and plenty of tea, snacks, and warm clothes to remain comfortable for the long day. So this is the same animation that you were seeing a little bit before, but in pen plot form. This landscape is located at the local crag in Knoxville's own Iams urban wilderness. And last summer, I purchased my first bike pannier and was thrilled to discover that I could bike from my home to the crag, carrying my climbing rope, clipping stick, harness, shoes, and quick draws. I knew with confidence that I could navigate the trail with something wheeled, which inspired my next endeavor, to bring the exhibit displays to the original site. I constructed this prototype for a wheeled digital diorama to fit perfectly in my car so that I could arrive to the Iams parking lot and wheel my equipment and the display on the trail to the site of the animation for the day. Over the course of the stop motion, I shifted my context to reflect the choreography of the fabric traversing the scanned site. I will say what drew me to this boulder as the starting point was the way it really stuck out when the sun hit it just so. But that also became difficult for my experiment when the sunlight began to wash out the legibility of the drawings on the paper, and I couldn't make out the image on the digital display. It was disappointing for the display not to show up quite as well as intended, as it isn't the easiest trip to make, and the portable generator also died sooner than I wanted. That may just be a cue to design a more trail traversable diorama and other power solutions for future excursions. Even if it died midway through, having this companion object in the scene was fascinating in and of itself, it was kind of ambiguous whether you would call it a piece of furniture, a wall, or maybe a window. There's more to this, but I'm going to keep going for time's sake. In his essay towards humanism through machines, Nicholas Negroponte, who's the founder of the MIT Media Lab, identifies 3 possible ways of having machines assist the creative design process. So 1, existing procedures can be automated, speeding up and reducing the cost of current practices. 2, existing methods can be altered to fit the constitution of the machine. Or 3, the process is evolutionary and is introduced to a mechanism that is also evolutionary, and a kind of mutual training and growth can be developed. Further in this essay, he refers to a distinction between computer-aidedness and computerized. I've been reflecting on this a lot as I look over the work I've produced thus far. This is really not intended to be nostalgic for physical or traditional formats, or even the handmade. It takes full advantage of advanced computational processes and simulation readily available to me. However, I have been curious how the logics of computerization structures the way we think and create, as well as what we create and what is imaginable. I have found a lot of joy in turning to the construction of the exhibit into my living laboratory for transcribing what I've learned from the screen into a physical, immersive experience. Each wall, table, and furniture piece is its own sort of thought experiment, or maybe prototype, about what it means to interact with and frame imagery and physical animations. Each wall, and these images I'm actually showing more so for the people who might be streaming in, because we'll be able to walk across the room for you guys to see the real exhibit. But you see a table surface that's playing animations that are the ones that I had a camera overlooking. You see a long rail that's also wheeled, and you see the diorama. So all of these are meant to be kind of movable for possible future uses. So this I actually did last night because I couldn't resist. It was a quick test run of how I might use this as the next evolution of my aluminum frame. The extra long cart actually takes inspiration from a similarly proportioned timber cart, which is designed to help you transport long timber members on varied terrain. So if you're building a tree house out in the woods, for instance. But in this case, I was seeing it as maybe a larger kind of vehicle to drive my animations. One last animation I'd like to share with you is something I produced for alwaysopen.net, and it's a metaphysical library in which you are given a piece of writing from another contributor to generate a visual response to. The text I was given was titled Transmission of the Breath by Ashton White. It's a tad dark. The character in the short story is basically cursed, and I won't read the whole text to you, but a small snippet reads, "The breath whispers a number. The number is how many breaths you have left. Exactly 1 month ago, my mind was inundated with everything known and unknown. Nothing I received matters except that one number. I've meticulously counted ever since. Using a Fitbit while asleep, I estimated a ratio of 1 to 4 breaths to heartbeats. If calculations serve correctly, around 700 remain." So I made 700 breaths in this case. This animation series, again, is not necessarily about stop motion or pen plotters or physics simulations. For me, it's a rediscovery of my own creative labor and slowness in an era of digital automation and ease, and to more deeply consider where I insert my own authorship within systems that are increasingly more opaque and computerized rather than perhaps computer-aided. I am left wondering, might we revive forgotten techniques from the past? To borrow some of the words from Negroponte, can we learn to commingle our programmed virtual present with more embodied analog mechanisms that evolve our cognitions about space, material, and experience that are kind of tucked away within the creative labor that digital processes are designed to optimize? That was a long sentence, but that's what I have for you. And I do have a compilation video I'd love to just throw on while we take questions. It's different when you see it like full screen.
Thanks, Julie. As a reminder, we do questions with the microphone. I know not everyone likes the microphone, but we do it for the streamers and for the archive.
Thanks, Julie. Wow, that was really, really good. Exciting to see, and so well worked, and there's a ton of work, and all the documentation is very you and very amazing to see. So thanks a lot. My question is about dimensionality, I think. Or actually, I have one question, but two versions of this question. I'd like to ask them both. Dimensionality, or maybe like something akin to dimension anxiety. So there were a couple of moments in the talk where one was where you started talking about the pen and about the way that the pen seemed to be more rich or somehow more interesting than the rendering. And I thought about that for a while, about the flatness of the 2D drawing of the pen versus the kind of infinite dimensionality maybe of the digital model. Like everything in a digital model is one-to-one and fully dimensionalized, and et cetera. And the flatness of the drawing is somehow, like, let alone the smudginess of the ink or thickness of the ink line or something like that. And then the other moment was when you're talking about climbing and about adding the Z dimension to your world, and that for you was crucial, to understand one can't understand the rock without seeing the rock in the Z dimension, as you put it. And I thought those were really interesting, like dimensional things, like adding a dimension to something or subtracting a dimension from something made you invested in it in a different way or something. And so that's the long version of this question. And the short version is, what number of dimensions is the ideal number of dimensions for you?
I'm comfortable with 2 dimensions because it's helpful to, okay, now I have to think of what is a dimension, but it's easy to think, okay, we have real world, digital world, things that are simulated, things that exist in our reality. And I can kind of toggle back and forth between those two, and the pen plotter is maybe a way in which the digital world kind of puts its foot into the physical world. And then when I'm doing the stop motions back in the landscape, maybe that's a way that the landscape is inserting itself back into my simulated digital world. So I am more comfortable with a spectrum where on either end there's digital, on the other end there's physical, but how can the ways that I interact with that world sort of shimmy back and forth, or maybe make a couple of leaps. But I think generally we are too far on the left and too far on the right, either or. But does that answer what a dimension is, because, or
Thank you, Julie. I learned a lot. And following on that thought, and also on what Carl was saying before about students, I was curious how these ideas find their way into your teaching architecture, what it looks like in terms of translating fellowship projects into teaching.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, I think digital literacy is a lot of what I am teaching. And I usually am finding cognitive tools from these exercises that can help students really understand the digital world that they are operating in. So like one of my favorite early assignments to give is a triptych, where I'm asking them to think about the frame and the margins of a frame relative to their 3D work or their 2D work, and how that starts to push against those boundaries. And with a triptych, you have 3 frames, and you have to start to think about how one world bounces to the next and the next. So I'm always learning kind of meta topics that I can bring into the studio that just sort of help them think about their use of digital tools in a slightly new way. I'm always thinking in terms of like my architecture studios, just about how they can investigate ideas through the way that they make things digitally as well. And I don't like using computational tools in the computerized sense, such as what Negroponte was saying, like you can do computer aided or computerized, and too often I feel like we're computerizing the method of designing a building. We're representing a model of a building and how it's going to look in the very end. And I'm always interested in how computerizing something is actually a way of rethinking it in new, novel ways. So
I will take the opportunity to sneak in a question about the spaces that you find yourself in, and maybe that gets to something that I think about a lot, which is like architects have a lot of anxiety about non-designed spaces or spaces that are part of our work that we don't control, we just sort of step into. One of the silliest ones is that you left some white space in the frame of your presentation often, right? Like that scares a lot of us, right? Like we just want the work to exist and be projected, but you let it exist sometimes with even like a drop shadow. And other times you're showing us the like space of the software, right? Like we're getting screenshots that show the like branded proprietary interfaces. And then of course there's like the space of your home that we're seeing a little bit, because like all of a sudden it's not just the stop motion on a surface. That surface is on a table, and that table is in a space, and you live in that space. Do you have an attitude about how and when you're comfortable with that? The degree to which you had to get over any hangups, or filters or parameters you use about when and how to take those like spaces you stepped into, or use by default because it's the good software that you can use?
Yeah, so it's easier for me to speak to the physical spaces than the digital spaces. But there were definitely situations where I was trying to crop out my bed. I live in a studio apartment, so it was kind of embarrassing if it was pointed just so, and also dealing with things in those spaces that I can't control. So the families that climb with a ranger day, my cat. It was really stressful to create stop motions in which things were very precise and delicate, and he would decide to get involved, and I had to become okay with that. Sunlight, wind, those are all things that kind of encroached. But as far as the digital spaces that I choose and operate in, I don't know. It's difficult to think about discomfort or comfort with those spaces. Yeah, I'd have to think more about that one. But I guess I can speak like to the margin element as far as how I deal with digital space, where I was always more interested in how we're seeing the images relative to one another, and that's where the margins became a vehicle to be like, okay, we have two images kind of zoomed out, and we're not caring so much about being immersed in the full space, but we're like taking a little bit of a step back and looking at it from many vantage points. So maybe there's something about space and immersion.
Yeah, I'm not your thesis advisor anymore, but my thinking is that like what you're doing really is like telling stories about your process, and you can only tell stories about the process if you acknowledge that those stories exist in like a setting, and so it's not really a choice to like draw the space of the software, but that's where the story happened. And so if you're really telling the full story, it can't exist without the place of that story.
It's funny, I had a conversation with my friend Andreas there the other day where he asked, do your animations have stories? And I'm still contemplating that element as well, in that there's the story of context and space that it's in, and there's also the story of caricatures and world of the animation that I've kind of ignored and backed off from so far.
Yeah, I like the meta stories the best. I like the fact that you acknowledged you needed to sip water and that was in your notes. My feeling is that there should have been a slide that says take a sip of water, and then you take a sip of water, and then we realize we're, sorry. Who else has a question?
Hello. Oh, hi. I really enjoyed the presentation. And it's good to see how it relates to our studio also. I noticed that, well, at least like throughout your talk, you kind of seem to have these separate workflows going, and maybe they were happening at the same time. Like you had the stitching of the frames, creating the animations with the pen, then also scanning the landscapes. And then towards the end, they seem to kind of merge into like a cohesive study. I was wondering at like, what was your aha moment, or like at what point did you decide to combine those two like distinct elements? And I don't know, just sort of the process behind that and where they merged.
Abigail told me that I sure was doing all of my prototyping, but she suggested that I needed a case study to kind of execute it in with a subject of sorts. And so the scans were something that I already had on hand that I've been enjoying quite a bit. And so it was more of a prompt to myself of like, okay, I can infinitely make subjects that are animated. I can make many jumping scaffolds, but how do I take on a subject that I haven't so far? So it started with like prompting from external feedback, and then like every kind of step of the way prompted other ideas. So the angles I just used one day as a guide, and then I realized they could be a framing element, and then I realized they could be hosts for these in the landscape, but it was always just on hand, what do I have that I can use next? But there are many aha. The aha of, oh, I can animate that seesaw timber cart thing happened yesterday.
This is going to be our final question. Thank you. Some of our question askers were very long-winded, so we have time for exactly one more.
I'll make it short. Something that's coming up for me as I look at especially like the most recent stuff you've been working on is the labor of movement and how you're riding the line of like blending worlds, but then also making it very difficult. Like making things accessible, but then also finding ways to make it slower. For example, your renderings, when they could be faster than they're slow. And can you talk a little bit about what movement means to you, or what the labor or the work of movement means to you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's basically encapsulating the whole thesis of the work is finding a way towards slower ways of thinking and working that are tapping into kind of what helps me cognitively understand how I'm working and thinking in new ways. And part of it is boredom with making things efficiently, and wondering if there's other ways that we've taken for granted. So sometimes I found that doing it myself is slower, but it keeps becoming something that's improvisational or like allows me to improv in ways I haven't before. I've also been thinking a lot about what it's like to be a musician, where you kind of start to read many other people's music, and the same sheet of music can be performed again and again, and you're kind of bringing it into your body, you're learning it kind of physically, and there's like it's like you download information or you download movement, and then you're able to improvise with it once you've downloaded it. So I've been finding links and thinking about how you learn through transcribing and how it then becomes something that you can instinctively do. But, yeah.
Thanks, Julie.
I would love for anyone to walk over to across the atrium to 103 to check out the work in real life in our dimension.